She was the greatest mathematician of her time. She taught princes and governors. She moved freely through the male-dominated world of ancient philosophy, wearing a scholar's cloak instead of traditional women's clothing. And in March 415, a mob dragged her from her chariot and tore her body apart with pottery shards. This is the story of Hypatia of Alexandria, and why her brutal murder marked the end of an entire era. While most women in the ancient world were confined to their homes, forbidden from education or public life, one woman stood at the center of intellectual Alexandria. She lectured to packed audiences. She advised the Roman governor. She solved mathematical problems that had stumped scholars for generations. Her name was Hypatia, and for over 20 years, she was untouchable. Until she wasn't. In the next 23 minutes, you'll discover how a mathematician became the target of political violence, how her commitment to reason made her dangerous, and why her death symbolizes one of history's most tragic turning points, when fear and fanaticism destroyed centuries of accumulated knowledge. We'll explore 5 pivotal moments in her life: her extraordinary education, her groundbreaking work in mathematics, her rise to philosophical leadership, the political trap that sealed her fate, and the brutal act of violence that ended her life. This isn't just ancient history. It's a story about what happens when reason becomes a threat to power. Here's what we'll uncover: her origins, how the daughter of a mathematician became the most educated woman in the Roman Empire, her mathematics, the revolutionary work that preserved ancient Greek knowledge, her philosophy, why crowds came from across the Mediterranean to hear her teach, her political trap, the power struggle between church and state that made her a target, her murder, the horrifying details of what happened in March 415, her legacy, why historians forgot her for over 1,000 years. Let's begin in Alexandria, around the year 370 CE, in one of the most intellectually vibrant cities the world has ever known. Hypatia was born around 360 to 370 CE in Alexandria, Egypt, then part of the Eastern Roman Empire and one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world. Her father was Theon of Alexandria, himself a distinguished mathematician and astronomer, and the last attested member of the legendary Alexandrian Museum. Most women of her era received no formal education whatsoever, but Hypatia's father had different plans. According to Byzantine sources, Theon wanted to raise what he called the perfect human, someone who was both physically and mentally exceptional. Theon personally supervised Hypatia's education, teaching her mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and rhetoric. She studied the works of Euclid, Ptolemy, Apollonius, and Diophantus, the mathematical giants of the ancient world. But her father also taught her about different religions and how to maintain physical health through exercise. This was radical. While other women were learning household management, Hypatia was mastering geometry. While others were confined to domestic spaces, she was being trained to think, argue, and lead. The Alexandria of Hypatia's time was a powder keg. By the late 4th century, the Roman Empire was fragmenting. Christianity was consolidating its power and attempting to eradicate pagan influence. The city that had once been home to the greatest library in the ancient world, containing perhaps 500,000 scrolls, was now a battleground between competing religious factions. Slavery had sapped classical civilization of its vitality. Rioting between Christians, Jews, and pagans was commonplace. The old intellectual traditions, philosophy, mathematics, scientific inquiry, were increasingly seen by the growing Christian church as dangerous pagan practices that needed to be suppressed. And into this volatile world stepped a young woman who refused to be silent. Hypatia didn't just study privately. She made a decision that would define her life. She chose to teach publicly. But here's what made her shocking to her contemporaries. She dressed in the clothing of a scholar or teacher, a philosopher's cloak, rather than traditional women's garments. She drove her own chariot through the streets of Alexandria. She moved freely through spaces that were supposed to be exclusively male. As one ancient source noted, she moved freely and unself-consciously through traditional male domains. In a society where women were treated as property and had few options, Hypatia's very existence was a challenge to the established order. This wasn't rebellion for its own sake. This was strategic. If she wanted to be taken seriously as a philosopher and mathematician, she had to present herself as a scholar, which meant adopting the visible markers of that role, regardless of her gender. And remarkably, it worked. Hypatia's first move was to establish herself as a serious mathematician, not just a curiosity. Her most significant contribution was her commentary on Diophantus's Arithmetica, a 13-volume work that laid the groundwork for algebra. Diophantus, often called the father of algebra, had created over 100 mathematical problems that required algebraic solutions. But his work was dense and difficult to understand. Hypatia's commentary didn't just explain these problems. She provided her own insights and refinements, clarifying complex algebraic concepts and making them accessible to future scholars. Modern researchers believe that parts of her commentary may actually survive, having been interpolated into later copies of Diophantus's original text. She also wrote an extensive commentary on Apollonius's conics, a work dealing with the geometry of conic sections, ellipses, parabolas, and hyperbolas. These shapes are fundamental to mathematics and physics, from orbital mechanics to optics. Though her commentary hasn't survived, the fact that she tackled Apollonius's advanced mathematics demonstrates that she was among the leading mathematicians of her day. As historian Michael Deakin notes, a high degree of mathematical accomplishment would have been needed to comment on Apollonius's advanced mathematics. But Hypatia wasn't content to work only with abstract mathematics. She pushed into astronomy, applying mathematical principles to understand the cosmos. She wrote a commentary on Ptolemy's Almagest, the critical astronomical text that provided a comprehensive model of the movements of stars and planets. Her insights helped clarify Ptolemy's complex theories, making them accessible to future astronomers and ensuring this knowledge was preserved. She also contributed to practical astronomy. Historical sources credit her with improving the design of the astrolabe, an ancient instrument used to measure the positions of celestial bodies. The astrolabe was essential for both navigation and studying the heavens, and Hypatia's refinements made it more accurate and easier to use. One source also credits her with inventing the hydrometer, a device used to determine the relative density and gravity of liquids. Whether she invented it or improved upon existing designs, this shows her ability to apply theoretical knowledge to practical tools, to bridge the gap between abstract mathematics and real-world applications. Around the year 400 CE, Hypatia achieved something extraordinary. She became head of the Platonist school at Alexandria. Think about what this meant. The Platonist school was one of the most prestigious intellectual institutions in the ancient world, and now it was being led by a woman in her 30s. She taught Neoplatonism, a philosophy based on the ideas of Plotinus and developed further by Iamblichus. Neoplatonism taught that there was an underlying reality, the One, that could be approached through the power of abstraction from Platonic forms. It emphasized logical thinking, mathematical studies, and the pursuit of truth through reason. Her lectures attracted students from across the Mediterranean. People traveled from other cities specifically to hear Hypatia speak. According to historical accounts, she had immense influence, despite having no formal political authority. Her status as a philosopher gave her tremendous symbolic power in a city struggling to hold itself together. And here's what made her dangerous to some. She advocated for religious tolerance. She taught students of different faiths. She showed that Christians, Jews, and pagans could engage in reasoned dialogue together. Hypatia's fourth strategic move was perhaps her most dangerous. She became a trusted advisor to Roman prefect Orestes, the governor of Alexandria. This wasn't about seeking power. Ancient philosophers were often consulted by rulers. Their wisdom was valued precisely because they weren't entangled in political factions. But in Alexandria's toxic political environment, this relationship became explosive. By all accounts, Orestes regularly sought Hypatia's counsel. They had public audiences where he would consult her on governance matters. In the language of antiquity, this made Orestes appear reasonable, measured, and wise, qualities that stood in stark contrast to other leaders who ruled through intimidation. Her presence at Orestes' side gave him legitimacy. It signaled that he valued reason over dogma, dialogue over decree. But this also made her a target. Hypatia's final tactical decision was deeply personal but politically significant. She rejected all offers of marriage and embraced a life of dedicated virginity. According to ancient sources, Hypatia was renowned for her beauty and had many suitors, but she turned them all down. Why? Because marriage would have ended her independence. A married woman in the Roman world was under her husband's authority. She would have been expected to manage a household, bear children, withdraw from public life. By remaining unmarried, Hypatia maintained her freedom to teach, write, travel, and advise. Her virginity wasn't about asceticism, it was about autonomy. It was a strategic choice that allowed her to continue her intellectual work unimpeded. Ironically, this choice aligned with Christian values of celibacy. Some of her students were Christians who admired her philosophy. One of them, Synesius of Cyril, later became a Christian bishop and maintained correspondence with her, praising her wisdom. For 2 decades, these 5 pillars held firm. Hypatia was untouchable, too respected, too connected, too brilliant to be challenged. But then the political ground shifted beneath her feet. In 412 CE, a new Christian bishop came to power in Alexandria, Cyril. Cyril was very different from his predecessor. He was ambitious, intolerant of pagan practices, and determined to consolidate Christian power over the city. Almost immediately, he came into conflict with Prefect Orestes. Their struggle revolved around competing jurisdictions and powers. Who really controlled Alexandria? The Roman governor or the Christian patriarch? What started as bureaucratic tension escalated into open conflict. Cyril expelled Jews from Alexandria. Orestes protested. Christian monks from the desert, the Nitrians, came to support Cyril and attacked Orestes in the street, throwing stones at him. One monk named Ammonius hit Orestes in the head with a stone, seriously wounding him. Orestes had Ammonius arrested and tortured to death. Cyril tried to make Ammonius a martyr, but the move backfired to gain popular support. The city was fracturing, and Hypatia stood in the middle. As tensions escalated, Christians loyal to Cyril began to whisper about Hypatia. According to ancient historian Socrates Scholasticus, they began to murmur that Hypatia had bewitched the governor and used her magic to keep him alienated from Cyril. They claimed she was using sorcery to influence Orestes, preventing reconciliation between the governor and the patriarch. Think about what this accusation reveals. Cyril's supporters couldn't understand why Orestes wouldn't simply submit to the bishop's authority. The only explanation that made sense to them was supernatural. This woman must be a witch. They saw Hypatia as the problem, the obstacle blocking resolution. In their minds, the system had stopped working because Hypatia had blocked the voices of Cyril and his supporters from participating in the conversations that mattered in Alexandria. Historical accounts make clear the murder wasn't about her mathematical work or her philosophy. It was political. She was targeted because she was perceived as influencing Orestes, as preventing him from backing down. As historian Edward Watts notes, Hypatia fell victim to political jealousy prevailed at time. This wasn't religious persecution in the simple sense. It was the violent collision of political power struggles in a city tearing itself apart. In March 415 CE, during the Christian season of Lent, a church lector named Peter the Reader gathered a group of Cyrillian supporters. We don't know what Peter and his associates initially planned to do. Most historians believe they probably intended to frighten Hypatia, to stage a confrontation that would pressure her to withdraw from her public role advising Orestes. They may have planned a noisy protest. They may have been angry enough to consider burning her house. But most scholars think they probably didn't set out with the explicit intent to kill her. But then they encountered her in public, possibly while she was teaching, possibly as she was returning home in her chariot. And in that moment, the mob's fear and rage found its target. What happened next is documented in multiple ancient sources, and the details are horrifying. The mob dragged Hypatia from her chariot. They tore off her clothes. They pulled her into a building called the Caesarion, a former pagan temple that had been converted into a Christian church. According to Socrates Scholasticus, they flayed her flesh from her bones using sharp pottery fragments, broken tiles or oyster shells. Some sources say they tore out her eyes. They dismembered her body while she was still alive. Her remains were then dragged through the streets of Alexandria and burned. She was approximately 45 to 55 years old. After Hypatia's murder, something remarkable happened. Many scholars left Alexandria. The city that had been the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean began its decline. The Alexandrian library, already damaged, was further diminished. According to Carl Sagan, it was as if the entire civilization had undergone some self-inflicted brain surgery, and most of its memories, discoveries, ideas, and passions were extinguished irrevocably. For over 1,000 years, Hypatia's name was largely forgotten. Her mathematical works were lost or absorbed into other texts. Her philosophical teachings were not preserved independently. Why? Because the victors write history. Christian historians minimized her significance or portrayed her death as an unfortunate excess by overzealous followers. Her identity as a pagan philosopher made her inconvenient to celebrate. It wasn't until the Renaissance and Enlightenment that scholars began to rediscover Hypatia and to recognize what had been lost when she died. Hypatia's murder has become emblematic of several broader historical forces. First, it represents the clash between reason and dogma. Hypatia stood for the value of logical thinking, mathematical rigor, and philosophical inquiry. Her murderers represented fear of ideas that challenged orthodoxy. Second, it symbolizes the suppression of women's intellectual contributions. For centuries after her death, women were systematically excluded from education and scholarship. Hypatia's story reminds us that this exclusion wasn't natural or inevitable. It was enforced through violence and intimidation. Third, her death marks a turning point in the decline of classical learning. As historian Edward Watts argues, Alexandria after Hypatia was a diminished place. The atmosphere of tolerance and intellectual exchange that had made it great was shattered. Finally, Hypatia's murder demonstrates what happens when political leaders weaponize mob violence. Whether Cyril directly ordered her death remains debated by historians. Most believe he didn't give explicit orders, but he created the atmosphere in which such violence became possible. He demonized his opponents. He encouraged his followers to see people like Hypatia as enemies of God. When you teach people that certain ideas or certain people are dangerous, you make violence thinkable. Today, Hypatia is recognized as one of the first women in mathematics whose life and work are reasonably well documented. She is celebrated as a pioneering figure in the history of women in philosophy and science. Mathematicians study the techniques she developed for Diophantine equations. Historians analyze what her life tells us about gender, power, and knowledge in the late Roman world. Philosophers cite her as an example of the courage it takes to pursue truth in dangerous times. In 2009, a major film about her life, Agora, directed by Alejandro Amenabar, brought her story to millions of people worldwide. Asteroid 238 Hypatia is named in her honor. Her name has inspired movements advocating for women's education and participation in STEM fields. But perhaps most importantly, Hypatia has become a symbol of intellectual courage, a symbol of what humanity loses when we choose fear over reason, when we silence voices that challenge us, when we destroy rather than debate. Hypatia of Alexandria lived in a time when knowledge was dangerous, when teaching the wrong ideas to the wrong people could get you killed, when being a woman who refused to stay silent made you a target. She chose to teach anyway. She chose to write. She chose to think freely and to encourage others to do the same. And yes, it cost her everything. But here's what her killers didn't understand. You can burn books. You can murder scholars. You can try to erase someone from history. But you can't kill ideas. 1,600 years later, we're still talking about Hypatia of Alexandria. We're still learning from her example. We're still inspired by her courage. And that's a victory they could never take away. So what did we learn today? First, Hypatia became the most prominent mathematician and philosopher of her time through strategic choices: education, public teaching, philosophical leadership, political advising, and intellectual independence. Second, her murder wasn't about her ideas in the abstract. It was about power. She was caught in a political struggle between civic and religious authority, and her influence made her dangerous to those who wanted total control. Third, her death represents a historical turning point, the moment when Alexandria began its decline as a center of learning, when centuries of accumulated knowledge started to slip away. If Hypatia's story moved you, wait until you hear about Zenobia, the warrior queen who conquered half the Roman Empire and declared herself empress. She challenged the mightiest empire in history and nearly won. That video is coming next in the Women in History series. If you found Hypatia's story powerful, hit the like button. Not because I'm asking you to, but because stories like this deserve to be heard. Subscribe if you want to learn about other women whose brilliance, courage, and defiance changed history. Women whose names were nearly erased, but whose legacies endure. And leave a comment. Do you think Hypatia's story is ultimately tragic or triumphant? Can someone who was murdered by a mob still be said to have won? I want to know what you think. Remember, history isn't just dates and names. It's the stories of real people who faced impossible choices and chose courage anyway. Hypatia of Alexandria chose to live as a free thinker in a world that wanted her silent. And because she made that choice, we're still talking about her today.